I know.
All right. What's up, y'all? How we doing? Who's ready to go to a yoga studio without a mask on Friday? No? You can't we're not celebrating that. I'm celebrating that. Privately. Welcome to Manny's. How's everyone doing? Are we alive? We're here ready to learn. I'm so excited and honored. We still have some balloons from the birthday party that was here on Saturday night. Were you here on the birthday party? Oh yeah, okay. Yeah, I love that. We also hosted a bat mitzvah on Saturday. So we do it all here at Manny's. We do bat mitzvahs, we do birthday parties, and tonight obviously we had this amazing conversation, which I'll introduce in a bit. Before we start, for whom is it your first time here at Manny's? Raise your hand. Nice and tall and proud. Welcome. Manny's is a physical, civic, and political gathering and event space. We host programming around politics, news, social justice, and civic life. We also have a nonprofit restaurant in the front, so if you purchase food and drink, you're supporting one of San Francisco's few nonprofit restaurants. Farming Hope hires and trains formerly homeless and formerly incarcerated individuals in our kitchen, and then trains them in restaurant skills and places them into full-time employment. So we're really proud of our kitchen. And we've got a political bookshop. And so I just want to quickly plug that after the event, Sheera has graciously made herself available, made time to sign the books that we had at the back. It's kind of like Squid Game, as in there's not enough spaces for everyone. So, but not as violent, hopefully, Sheera. No, like murdering the people that don't get a book. So that was, I'm so sorry, I just went there. Anyway, there aren't enough books for everyone, so if you want a book, get in line first. Before we start, we have a tradition here at Manny's where we ask everyone to take a very quick second and introduce yourself to someone around you that you do not already know. So go ahead and take a second and say your name and what's one thing you're excited about learning tonight. Go ahead. Todd here. All right. You make some friends? Anyone single? Woo! Come on, single. We've got opportunities for you as well. Not tonight, another night. So just want a couple quick thank yous. We had some amazing folks up front that served. Precious Green, who is maybe just left. She is our director of programming. It's Kojin's first night as our new events associate. Welcome, coaches, to the team. Ram Oliveris is in our book nook over there. We have all of our fabulous folks on Zoom. We're one family for the next hour and a half, hour, let's say. And tonight's conversation is it's our first book talk since the pandemic. Well, it's not over, but since the reopening, which is really exciting. So Sheera, thank you for being our first book talk author. Oh wait, no, it was Michaela Rabinovich with the DA's office. Shoot, never mind. Let's just assume for the case of yes. I'm so sorry. It's the first one that I've been to. How about that? The book is An Ugly Truth, and it's so topical. It is so of today. There's so much that we need to talk about with regards to Facebook and its quest for global domination. And I'm really glad that my friend Kate Conger, the New York Times reporter, is here tonight to do this interview. Nellie Bowles, unfortunately, had to leave at the last second. We love her, we miss her, but we're blessed, we're twice blessed now to have Kate here from the New York Times, be in conversation about the book, about Facebook's role in the world, and I hope also people can leave tonight with some ideas of what they can do about some of the problems that you've identified in the book. And without further ado, Sheera and Kate.
Thank you. Cool. Okay. Sheryl, I'm so excited to do this. I've known Sheryl for a really long time, and when she got the book deal, I was really excited for her. Really excited that the book is now out and she gets to share it with people. It's very under wraps and very secret for a long time. So it's really exciting to have you guys all here. Thank you for coming. Sheryl, I wanted to start with this moment in the book where you're writing about the events of January 6th, and you're talking about Facebook employees observing some of the posts and some of the content that were being posted on Facebook earlier in the day, and being so concerned about it that they were asking Mark Zuckerberg to make a phone call to the White House to talk about the content that they were seeing. So can you describe some of the posts that were causing this kind of concern?
Absolutely. I think that moment is so telling because it shows how Facebook as a company is actually incredible at understanding what is happening on its platform, in keeping track in real time of what people are posting, what kind of trends they're seeing. So this day rolls up and they very astutely decipher that this is a potential day for violence, that their teams have to be totally geared up, their dangerous orgs team, their security team, their executives, everyone's ready to go that day. Because for weeks, they have watched people post in private Facebook groups and pages the potential of violence in Washington. They're seeing them post photographs of the guns that they're going to bring to Washington. There are discussions like, is your trunk big enough for my AR case? Can you bring it from this state across that state line? Do you know how much ammunition you can fit in this part? It is very specific discussion, which leaves no room for interpretation that some people are planning violence. And so you have this group of engineers that are watching this day near, and they're basically putting their arms up in the air and telling their bosses, we gotta roll out all the stops. They call them BTG, break the glass measures. They're getting those ready because they're getting ready to break that glass. They know that this could be an unprecedented day for them. And yes, at one point they do talk about having Mark Zuckerberg call the White House. They want him to call President Trump and basically talk him down, which, now we sit here and it's like, yes, the CEO of a tech company in Silicon Valley, he's our last resort for talking down President Trump. But they refuse, right? And they actually do so because they're worried that it's going to leak to the press, that if Zuckerberg calls Donald Trump, it will get out that that phone call happened. And there will be concerns that he censored Donald Trump and that he somehow guided Donald Trump. And so out of that abundance of caution, they tell him not to make the call, and let's just wait and see what happens on January 6th.
Got it. Okay. And from what I understand, this kind of content, the violent content, sort of extreme content, the inflammatory content is really successful on Facebook. Can you talk about why that kind of stuff makes waves on Facebook, gets likes, gets views in the way that other content does not?
Yeah, it's interesting, right? So in 2018, Mark Zuckerberg gets up on a stage and he makes this announcement that Facebook wants to focus on meaningful social interactions. In the company, they call it MSI. And the idea is that they want people to connect to their friends. Doesn't that sound really nice if someone gets up on stage and they're like, we really want to prioritize you connecting to your friends. We're not going to prioritize all that boring news articles and things that we think are divisive or political. Like, let's highlight the content from your friends. what that leads to in real life is posts that are not necessarily authoritative, but those written by friends and family, people that you know, that rise to the top of your newsfeed. They're given the highest weight in Facebook's ranking system. And in that same system, emotive posts, anything that inspires emotion in you is gonna go to the top. And so their algorithms are really carefully calculated to see like what is the depth of human experience, what emotion drives human engagement. And I think, it doesn't take a psychologist to realize that anger is a great impetus for action. If you are angry, you are likely to leave more comments. You are likely to click that share button. Even if you're sharing it to disagree with it, you're more likely to interact. And their systems read all that interaction as positive, net positive. More interaction is better. More interaction is more time on the platform. And so over time, you have these algorithms increasingly trained to focus and to highlight this kind of really divisive content that turns up anger, that turns up resentment. I mean, we just talked about January 6th. Stop the Steal was one of the most viral movements to ever grow on Facebook. It was this idea that the election had been stolen from Donald Trump, that the vote had been irregular and that fraud had occurred. There was no truth to it. I mean, as reporters, we can say that now because we reported out every rumor. But it got people so angry. They were so angry at the possibility that the election was stolen that the Stop the Steal groups were a runaway hit. And Facebook itself was surprised at how quickly these groups added new members because people were so worked up.
Okay, so there's a lot of angry content, a lot of divisive content on Facebook. And I don't think I'm spoiling anything to say that, this is something that Facebook has been grappling with for a long time. You see all these moments throughout the book where someone raises the concern, raises an issue, and, like this phone call to Trump, it doesn't happen, right? Nothing gets done about it. So can you talk a little bit about what you think is going on at the company that allows them to see these red flags and kind of blow past them?
Facebook is actually stuck in a difficult place because its chief executive, Mark Zuckerberg, has told them to focus on certain things, right? One of that is meaningful social interaction. He's made that a priority. And so all the engineers downwind of the company have to focus on it. Another is growth. Facebook may have officially changed its motto from move fast and break things, but we interviewed close to 400 people for this book, most of whom are still employed at Facebook. And not a single person we spoke to said that the momentum and the push behind growth had been reduced in recent years. Growth is still the North Star at Facebook. And so if your company depends on astronomical growth and this idea of meaningful social interaction, i.e. emotive posts, there's a limited amount you can do as an engineer, right? Like you've got certain metrics you've got to meet. You've got certain quotas if you want to keep your job. And so you're constantly, iterating on these products, but ultimately your bosses are telling you push the products. I mean, I'm sorry to curse, but it's what they say. They say, fuck it, ship it. If it encourages growth, if the interaction rate on it is very, very high. And so we talked to, dozens of engineers at the company who said, I felt awful. I knew I was pushing a product that was likely going to lead to more hate speech or more misinformation being shared or more just divisive content. But the metrics told me that that was the product my company needed.
Okay, so we have a company that's driven very much by the idea of needing to grow and also the drive for that kind of emotive content. Will you just describe how that kind of growth and that kind of emotion ends up being profitable for Facebook and how they kind of take all of that content and turn it into money?
Yeah, I mean, this gets to the heart of Facebook's business model, which is that Facebook makes money through ads. I mean, Zuckerberg famously answered a question during his congressional testimony. He was asking, how does Facebook money? And he answered, well, we sell ads, Senator. It's not that simple. Yes, Facebook sells ads. They are probably the most profitable ad company in the world. But the reason these ads are so important and so expensive, and the reason pretty much every major advertiser on the planet wants to advertise with Facebook, is that Facebook collects an incredible amount of data on you. The more time you spend on the platform, the more data it has on you as an individual. And the more data it has on you as an individual, the more it can give its advertisers in the way of information that like, I, Sheera Frenkel, would love to go on a holiday in Hawaii within the next 6 to 8 months. And so you should probably try and sell me a bathing suit or a new pair of flip-flops or great cheap tickets or whatever it is. But they know so much about me through my social graph that they can sell these really effective ads. Companies can make money off me because they know exactly what my interests are. And the feedback loop of this is that the more time you spend on Facebook, the more ads they have a chance to show you. So advertisers are like doubly satisfied. Oh, we're getting hyper-targeted ads. We're gonna get an ad in front of a person who's likely to buy our product, and they're probably gonna spend more time on Facebook than they would on, you know, a radio station or a TV channel where they might just change the network and watch something else. And we don't know who exactly, I mean, we know roughly, but not really who it's gonna reach. On Facebook, I can run an ad tomorrow saying, I want an individual between the ages of 30 and 35 who owns a dog, who's likely to get married in the next 6 months, and who votes Republican to see this ad. It's that specific. So you can imagine how for an advertiser, that's really attractive. You're gonna spend a lot of money on an ad like that.
Okay, so the ad side of the house, that's sort of Sheryl Sandberg's domain, right? And then the product side of the house, that's Mark Zuckerberg's domain. Okay, so can you tell me a little bit about the relationship between the two of them as they're running the company and how that's changed recently?
You know, we thought about it kind of as a marriage when we were writing the book. They meet and they kind of have this courtship, and it's great. They really like each other. They answer each other's needs. She is good at everything that Mark Zuckerberg doesn't give a shit about. He doesn't want to go to Washington. He doesn't care about the business. He doesn't really want to deal with policy. And that's her world. She really deeply cares about these things. And so she's able to basically come in and say, I will handle all the parts of the company you don't like, and I'll be really, really good at it, because she is. Ultimately, she grows Facebook into what it is today, which is $1 trillion company. But the problems in Facebook, and I think objectively, if you look at this, the products are largely introduced, the problems, are largely introduced in the product side of the company. She's the one that ends up having to explain them to Congress. She's the one that ends up having to defend them. So when Cambridge Analytica happens and the company, the product division of the company makes a deal to sell data to a number of third-party apps, she's the one that kind of becomes the face of that problem and has to go to Congress and has to speak to senators and explain, oh no, we care about privacy and we're going to protect users' data. You know, she's the one that kind of takes the fall for that. And
do you think that she sees it as that she has to go and clean up his mess, or do you think she sees it as like, this is my part of the job that I'm really good at, and I'm excited to go out here and kind of be the face of this issue?
You know, we've spoke to a lot of people that are close to Sandberg, and I think she would never ever portray it. She's too polished to ever say anything other than it's my job and I defend Facebook to my core because I believe in Facebook as a company. But we know that privately to friends, to people she trusts, which is a very small circle, she says, yeah, I'm cleaning up messes made in other parts of the company. And worse, like, she's increasingly blamed for these messes. Mark Zuckerberg is increasingly finding fault with her and her handling of it because she isn't able to smooth things over in Congress the way she used to.
Okay, so I don't know a ton about Sheryl Sandberg, but I think she's really interesting. And I think one of the things that fascinates me about her is that, you know, she's talked about as she was supposed to be Facebook's fixer in Washington, right? She's supposed to be the one to go and speak to Congress and kind of make these problems go away. But I'm curious how she amassed that power, that influence in the first place, right? She was an ad executive at Google. Like, how did she become this big figure in Washington?
Well, she actually came from Washington.
Oh.
Yeah, it's something about her history I think a lot of people don't know. She was Larry Summers' protege, and she was in the Treasury Department. She had a pretty large and influential circle of people in Washington. And it's interesting, Sheryl Sandberg grew up in a family that was quite political. Her parents lived in Florida, but they were very, very involved in the cause of Soviet Jewry and helping people, Jews specifically, refugees, leave the former Soviet Union after its collapse. The idea of public service was really important to her parents and therefore to her. And so she actually imagined for herself this career in Washington. She thought she was going to follow in the steps of her parents and have a life of public service. And from the people who knew her in her Google days, and actually I don't think a lot of this is in the book. I think we had to cut some of these chapters.
This is fascinating.
At one point, this book was twice as long as its actual published version, just to make it readable. But we learned a lot about her early days at Google and her telling people this is, you know, this is kind of like I'm taking a brief detour off my path and I'm gonna head right back to Washington and have my, that was her journey in her mind. But then she is really successful at Google and incredibly successful at Facebook. And if you kind of look at her trajectory leading up to Lean In, you can see how, yeah, she's posed for a comeback to Washington. She's got this great movement, Lean In, she's seen as a feminist figure. And Clinton is talking to her in 2016 about coming back and being the head of the Treasury Department. It was all lined up for Sheryl Sandberg. And then Donald Trump wins the election. And Facebook, begins what we currently know as its news cycle of crisis after crisis after crisis.
So do you think that her influence in Washington waned just because of the Trump presidency, or is it sort of the combined effect of that presidency and, Facebook sort of falling out of favor and getting all of this scrutiny?
I mean, there's no doubt that she was more effective in a Democratic administration because she had such close ties to Nancy Pelosi and to other influential Democrats. When Trump comes in, I mean, part of the problem is that he doesn't work the way previous US presidents have worked. If he was a traditional Republican president, she would have been a traditional operator in Washington, but he's not. So you see in our book, we have an early scene where like Corey Lewandowski comes to Facebook's offices in Washington, DC and interviews for a job. I mean, Facebook is scrambling to figure out like, well, who can we hire that can give us an inroad with the Trump administration, because we don't know how this White House is going to work. And then ultimately the Democrats are really mad at Facebook for what happened. They blame Facebook for the Russian ads, for the divisive content, for the Macedonian content. I mean, they're worked up. And so the friends Sheryl Sandberg had in Washington, people like Nancy Pelosi, those doors are not open to her in the way they used to be. And the Democrats become, in some ways, the real threat to Facebook in Washington because they're the ones calling for regulation. They're the ones calling for monopoly charges to be brought against Facebook.
Got it. Okay. So there's been a lot of Facebook news in the last couple of weeks. The Wall Street Journal just published a bunch of investigations based on these files from a whistleblower. Can you just kind of catch everybody up? Let us know, what did we learn from those files that we didn't already know about Facebook?
Yeah, I mean, I personally loved the Wall Street Journal reporting because for me, it was like seeing the receipts for everything we had written about in the book. We had spoken to hundreds of Facebook employees who told us about these research projects and about decisions made on the algorithms. And now here's this woman who has left Facebook with, I think she said 22,000 documents that she had photographed before leaving the company. And they are just an immense body of research which show decision-making over the years. I think the Wall Street Journal, so far there's been 7 articles published and there will be more as I understand it. And it's reporting on everything from how Facebook knew about human trafficking that was happening on its site, to the potential harms of Instagram, to how the company made decisions on its algorithms about what to favor and how to make decisions that ended up with misinformation being promoted, which I touched on earlier. So it's all the receipts that we've kind of been hearing people talk about, but to see it in hard data like that, I think is incredibly powerful. And that's why we have congressional hearings. We've had one already, and as I understand it, we're likely to have more. And I think it's really given energy to this new way of thinking where we kind of hit this at the end of the book, but lawmakers have been really focused on very specific content decisions, right? Like, why did you take down that account? Why did you remove this piece of content? That's a free speech argument that in the United States, you can fight for the next 30 years. It's really difficult to fight a free speech.
Just 30?
I mean, 100, right? Like, it's just, and as a journalist, it's just like you can see the landmines ahead of you. But finally, I think lawmakers are doing something really effective, which is that they're talking about the algorithms rather than the content. People have a right to say what they want to say, but does Facebook have a right to promote it? Should Facebook be recommending people join conspiracy theory groups and anti-vaccine groups? They can exist, but why should Facebook promote them and put them at the top of your newsfeed and recommend you join them? That's now the question that lawmakers are turning to, and it's such a more straightforward and powerful path forward on legislation.
Yeah, well, and I think a lot of the discussion from these files too is focused on Instagram, how it affects young people, particularly young women, and I think a lot of it is about that kind of algorithmic push, like are you driving young women towards content that's gonna make them feel bad about themselves, content that's gonna promote eating disorders, like what is the algorithm pushing them towards? And I understand that Facebook kind of pushed back on its own research and said, well, you know, our sample sizes aren't good in our research, and there's other reasons to distrust this research that we did. So what do we actually know about Instagram's effect on young people?
Well, we know that the studies were small, right? And so Facebook's right in saying that, although I think they're being disingenuous, because I think if they were to be fully transparent about this, they would say that Frances Haugen made one research study public so far. There are easily 100 or so studies that we know about that have been done on Instagram. So they have a huge body of research that they're sitting on about how Instagram affects teenagers and specifically young girls. I think that anyone who knows a teenager on Instagram has seen them struggle with some of the body image issues around it, with some of the questions of how do I live up to this aspirational life that Instagram has set up for me. And I think that the reason that the Wall Street Journal article was so effective, and the reason why, that study, so many people were eager to believe it, even though it was a small sample size, was that it confirmed what we anecdotally kind of see, which is that, yeah, a teenage girl struggling with body positivity or body image in general is probably gonna have that exasperated, by being on Instagram. So I think that it was, powerful in that way. And I think that, again, something lawmakers are moving forward on right now is forcing Facebook to be transparent about the research it's already conducted.
Right, okay. And so I think that the Instagram issue is also interesting because, the debate about this made Facebook pause Instagram for Kids. So can you describe what Instagram for Kids was supposed to be and why they decided not to release it?
So the research was on 13 to 18-year-olds, which is legally the age that Facebook can currently target. 13 is as young as Facebook is allowed to go. Instagram for Kids was a product that was in development that, honestly, we don't know a lot about it because they've kept it under wraps, but it was meant to be for under 13-year-olds. And they claimed it was going to be a safe space, it was going to have different guardrails, but, I'll also say that so far, they hadn't brought in child safety experts or child psychologists or data scientists and outside researchers. And so when this news broke in the Wall Street Journal, there was a huge outcry of them saying, well, why should we trust you to make a safe product for kids when you haven't done these basic things of bringing in outside independent experts to advise you?
So if you know that Instagram is bad for young people, why make a new Instagram for even younger people if we're not ready to talk about?
Right, even more vulnerable. And that's basically what the research is kind of pointing to, is the younger you are, the more vulnerable you likely are. And now we have lawmakers saying, well, should this even be allowed? Is there a healthy version of social media for a kid under 13? The answer to that might just be no. It might be no social network is gonna be able to have enough guardrails in place to be healthy for someone under the age of 13.
Yeah. Has any of this reporting changed the way you use social media or the way you think about letting your kids use social media?
My kids are really young. They are toddlers. So I think one thing I feel good about is that we're having this discussion now, and by the time they're old enough to ask for social media, I do hope we have laws in place. I do hope a lot of this has been legislated. And in terms of my own use, I use Facebook a lot and Twitter a lot for work, but my Instagram is private and I use that largely to connect with family and friends, and that's it. Please don't add me on Instagram because I don't generally add anyone on Instagram.
But follow Sheera on Twitter for sure.
Twitter is fine. But I, Kate, you noticed when I walked in here, the first thing I did was turn off my Bluetooth, Wi-Fi, and my location, which I had used to drive here. I am very, very careful about locking all that down and not keeping things on my phone. I don't have any of Facebook's apps on my phone because I report so much on the company. But I try to be really cautious, and I think of it as hygiene. And I think that when you allow these apps into your life, and I think a lot of us have, because it in many parts of the world is the only way to reach people, it's so important to think about how you're using them and how public you made yourself on them.
Yeah, I think this is sort of a diversion, but I've noticed a lot of my friends who have kids now are kind of in this debate where either they won't post their kids' face on social media at all. I think they're worried about facial recognition. They don't want their kids' face out there. And then on the other side, I have friends who are making Instagram specifically for their babies. So their baby has its own Instagram account and there's no in between.
Yeah, it's my husband and I have this debate, honestly. I mean, I have told him that I feel like I read this interesting report that under the age of 5, kids' faces change so much that the facial recognition software is essentially not really effective in predicting what kids will look like when they're older. And so I've kind of thought about, yeah, I'll be fine posting them until they're 5 years old and then I'll stop.
Interesting.
Because their faces will likely change so much after the age of 5 that no one will be able to go back and find that these, even though my account is private and so the public can't find. So I think about it on that level. I mean, that's where my brain goes. I don't want them to be 18 and 20 or whatever and applying for a job and for somebody to dig up an embarrassing baby photo I posted. But yeah, I do think it's important to think about that. And I have friends also who have done Instagram accounts specifically for their children. I feel like I'd be pissed if my parents did that.
I would freak out if my mom had an Instagram account.
Right. I don't know if I'd like, so that's my personal, I mean, everyone, you do you, people should do what they want, but I just think we all need to be thinking a lot more about how we use social media and what kind of accounts we create and what we want to exist in perpetuity online.
Yeah. Okay. So the whistleblower Frances Haugen was just in Washington testifying for Congress, and she made some recommendations about how she thought they should approach the problem of legislating for Facebook. Can you kind of describe what her proposal is?
I mean, she's got a few on the table. She talks a lot about thinking about the algorithms, and she talks a lot about transparency and the need for more transparency. I think she proposes some things that I think Congress is going to have a hard time around. For instance, raising the age, making it so that 13 is still too young, and saying you have to be 18 and up to get online. I think that, I imagine Congress will have a hard time changing something like that. She's also, she at one point talked a little bit about how Twitter and other companies have done really interesting research into what's effective in stopping misinformation, and should they share that research between companies, and should there be a best practices. I think that's going to be hard. I think getting that kind of, sharing between companies and that kind of uniform approach is difficult. At the end of the day, these companies have to protect themselves and they're in business and they want to continue to be successful in business. So I do think that some of her proposals are more likely to be picked up by senators than others.
Okay. Is there a way that you think that Congress should go about legislating Facebook? Or are they not even the right body to try to rein in the company?
I think that they're all we have.
So you're not trusting the Facebook oversight board that they set up for themselves?
I actually think the Facebook oversight board is super smart in that in their last ruling on the Trump account, they said, we are not, and you didn't empower us to make these decisions. You did not give us a body of codified law to follow that would allow us to make a decision on Trump, and don't make us your fall guy. Like, we're not gonna make your difficult decisions for you. And I think that was such a smart move on the part of the oversight board, because they said, hey, if you're not gonna actually give us absolute power and follow our rulings as if we are a Supreme Court, like don't go part way with us on this. So I don't think that's the right place. I definitely think Facebook isn't gonna regulate itself.
Okay, so Congress is the only hope then. Is there an attack that you think works?
Look, I think ultimately, like, the elephant in the room is that Mark Zuckerberg is still the CEO of this company. When people ask me what can change Facebook, I say, well, they've had the same, not just Mark Zuckerberg, but the inner suite of executives are the same people they've always been. If a company, can you imagine another company making this many mistakes, right? Like this many problems, and for nothing to change in the C-suite? And by nothing, I mean that things have changed. Whistleblowers have left, people who have called out mistakes, and I'm thinking here of people in our book like Alex Stamos, the founders of Instagram, the founders of WhatsApp, people who were outliers at Facebook and its family of apps, and people who did raise their hand and say, hey, I think this is a problem, have left. And instead, you have this group of individuals who are largely white males who are making a majority of the decisions, and it's a very weirdly cohesive group. Like they've almost all gone to Ivy League schools, they hang out together, they party together. It's really entrenched, and because of Facebook's voting structure and share structure, there's no way for anyone to force Mark Zuckerberg to do something he doesn't want to do. So, ultimately the best way for Facebook to change is for a different chief executive to take over and to make different decisions.
Is it just through the share structure that Mark is retaining power? Are there other ways that he kind of asserts his dominance within the company?
Well, the share structure is the most powerful because he has the voting shares, and so even the board, Facebook's board, is there just really in an advisory capacity. They know that. They can't force Mark to do anything he doesn't want to do. It's more than that though. It's the culture of the company that elevates him to this godlike stance. Everything he says, people follow as if it's like, a genius kind of mantra. People dress like Mark Zuckerberg. They copy his sports, whether it's hydrofoiling or fencing. I'll note, by the way, that every sport that Mark Zuckerberg plays is a solo sport. I always find that interesting. He is not a team player. Think about it. He fences, he hydrofoils. I don't know if that's the right term, but either way, he's a skier, he is a kayaker. The guy doesn't play team sports. They copy that, and it's interesting because he's amassed more power over years, and that he's taken over parts of the company that formerly were the purview of Sheryl Sandberg or of someone else. And so again, if anything, after Cambridge Analytica, Russian election interference, everything that's happened over the last 3 years, he hasn't delegated. He hasn't been like, oh, I made the wrong call on that. Let me bring in someone who's an expert and delegate them this responsibility. Instead, we have a chapter in the book, wartime leader. Instead, he has amassed more power, become a wartime leader, and said, only I can fix it. That is not the actions of someone who wants to deviate greatly from the path he has been on since the age of 20, 21.
It's fascinating. Okay, I want to talk a little bit just about the nuts and bolts of writing the book and putting it together. How are we doing on time? Are we good? Should we talk more? Should we talk less? Okay. Okay, we're not going to talk about how you wrote the book. It's time for Q&A. They can ask those questions. Okay, does anyone have a question for the lovely Sheera? Yeah, go ahead.
There's another book touching on Facebook about Peter Thiel, the contrarian.
Yeah.
That reported a meeting that Thiel brokered with Zuck and the White House, Kushner, and Trump. And apparently this reporting is that they reached some kind of an understanding about misinformation and they would just like let it run.
Mm-hmm.
And I was just wondering if you could confirm the reporting of that. And I'm also curious, do you think that Zuckerberg and Facebook wanted Trump to win?
But real quick, did everyone hear his question okay, or should I repeat it? Okay, yeah, so he was asking about this book called The Contrarian. It's about Peter Thiel, who's an early Facebook investor and is on the board. And in the book, it says that Peter Thiel brokered this meeting between Mark Zuckerberg and Jared Kushner, and that they had sort of come to this agreement that they would they would take a light approach to taking down misinformation. They would not take down too much. They would try to be really cautious about censoring. And so the first part of the question was whether Sheryl could confirm that that was true and that that meeting had taken place. And then there was a second part of it that I've already forgotten to remember it.
But whether Facebook and Zuckerberg wanted Trump to win.
Oh, yes, whether Facebook and Zuckerberg wanted Trump to win the election.
So I really like Max, and I really enjoyed that book. I will say that we heard the same anecdote and we reported it out and we found it to not be true. That actually Mark had come to that decision before the meeting he had in the White House. We spoke to several people that were in that meeting and there was a discussion about the elections, about what was going to happen, but Zuckerberg had actually already given 2 internal speeches at that point saying this was going to be their stance on political speech and this was going to be their stance on misinformation. So he had already laid out a policy before that Trump meeting, which he did not deviate from. So yeah, I unfortunately can't, it's just not what our reporting showed. But I will say that it is a great book and I really enjoyed it and I highly recommend anyone interested in Peter Thiel, who's a fascinating character here, in Silicon Valley, to read that book. But on the second question, you know, I've wondered that because I think that that Mark Zuckerberg, you know, his personal politics are, you know, he's a libertarian, but I think he probably votes Democrat. Trump was the guy he knew, and they'd actually done okay with the Trump administration. And I think they knew that an incoming Democratic administration was going to be tougher on them in terms of regulation. And they'd already heard rumors about Lena Khan being appointed to the FTC, and she's a real tough lady. So I wonder myself whether Mark, in his, you know, heart of hearts, thought, oh, Trump could be better for us. I don't know though, because Trump, like, who knows what another Trump presidency would have brought in terms of him challenging Facebook's norms and using his platform in a way that Facebook really struggled to get a handle on. Trump being in the news meant Facebook was constantly in the news, so I'm not sure. I can't tell you how Facebook felt about that. I will say that yes, as people suspect, the majority of Facebook employees did vote for Biden in the last election. That's pretty established at the company.
All right, I saw your hand and then we'll come up front. Yeah, go ahead.
Should I take my last on or take it?
Whatever you're comfortable with, I can hear you.
I guess my question is, as a Facebook user, like we're talking about what it would be like if a new CEO would take over, like from Zuckerberg. But I guess my question is, like, who would that be, or who would be next in line? Like, would it be Sandberg or somebody like I remember when Steve Jobs handpicked Tim Cook to take over?
Okay, that's actually a really good question. Okay, so the question is, if Mark Zuckerberg were to leave Facebook, who would be the next in line to take over as CEO?
This is like Zuckerberg's baby, I guess.
Yeah.
Right, this is his creation, it's his baby.
Internally, they think it's a guy named Chris Cox, who's their head of product. Chris has been at the company for a very, very long time. He's one of their earliest employees. He is personally very close to Mark Zuckerberg. He is sometimes called their moral compass. He left Facebook briefly following the 2016 elections. I think he was out of the company for a year and a half or so, and then something brought him back in. They managed to convince him to rejoin, and there's been a lot of speculation that the reason he came back was that he was told basically, if you come back, you will be the eventual successor. It might take 20 years, it might take whatever, but you are the person that is closest to thinking in Mark Zuckerberg and most likely to replace him
You're
eventually.
the candidate.
Yeah.
Okay, you had a question, right? Okay, go ahead.
One argument that I've heard people say in favor of Facebook is, well, for all of its faults, it's better than some of the other social media that are more popular with young people, like TikTok or. I'm curious what your thoughts are about that.
Okay, so I'm just gonna repeat the question, sorry, I just wanna make sure everyone can hear. So the question is, you know, one of the counter arguments for Facebook is that, you know, it may have its faults, but what about these other social media platforms like TikTok or Snapchat that have a large youth following that might be worse overall for them?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's a great question, right? TikTok is the most popular app among teens right now, not Facebook. And so there are concerns both over what kind of impact TikTok has on their lives and also just that it's a Chinese company, it's not an American company. And that really bothers a lot of people here in the US, especially in the US government. I think the focus has been on Facebook because they're American, there's more chance for regulation and legislation to affect them. And because ultimately, globally, they are far and away the biggest. This is a company that across the 3 family of apps has over 3 billion users. And, you know, it's kind of where Facebook goes, others follow. We see TikTok mimicking a lot of Facebook's enforcement actions. So if Facebook removes a certain hashtag or a certain type of content, TikTok will often do the same. And so one of the ways that people have kind of pushed TikTok to take action is to get Facebook to do it first. Now, I mean, TikTok, I personally am fascinated by TikTok. And
Sheryl and I are both heavy TikTok
Yes.
users.
I think their algorithm is fascinating. All of it, like the implications of it are really interesting to me. But I am very, very curious on where that goes, where the inevitable conclusion of this is, because I see them making a lot of the same mistakes Facebook made in its early days. So I do wonder where this is all leading us in a few years.
Yeah, and I think a lot of tech reporting gets driven by like the platforms that tech reporters spend a lot of time on. You know, Twitter has a smaller user base than Snapchat, and yet you read much, much more about Twitter in the news because reporters spend their lives on Twitter. And, you know, I think TikTok deserves a lot more coverage. I think they're so interesting. And I think their algorithm is really interesting. If you haven't spent time on TikTok, you should. I like when I'm using social media to try to kind of game out how is this algorithm learning about me. And with Instagram, it's very, very obvious. You know, like I will click on an ad for a dress and then my next 5 ads are similar dresses. And it's like, okay, that's very clear. But you know, when I signed up for TikTok, I was like, I'm not gonna give it any information. I'm not gonna give it my contacts. I'm not gonna like any videos. I'm not gonna follow anyone. I'm just gonna scroll. And somehow it still knows everything about me. And I'm not sure what I did to let TikTok know who I am and everything I like, but it does know. And so that's super interesting. And I think, yeah, I hope there's more coverage of it. I hope more tech reporters spend a lot of time on it because it's a fascinating platform.
I want to add one more thing about TikTok I find interesting is that I interviewed a VP there, and he said that as a company, they've made a conscious decision to elevate teenage producers of content who presented imperfect versions of their lives. And you can see that the content on TikTok is kind of curated for you, the things that appear on the For You page. Imagine it's like the home page or the news feed or whatever on Facebook. And I noticed that like teenage girls are dancing and there's messy clothes on the floor behind them, or they're not really fully made up in makeup, or they're, you know, celebrating having different body types. And that's a conscious decision TikTok made to promote that, because it doesn't want the Instagram thing of all their influencers looking just Photoshop perfect all the time. So I'm kind of curious where that goes, right? Like, how does that affect youth culture? How does that affect teenagers?
Okay, let's do some questions over here behind my back where I can't see people as easily. Okay, you in the black mask? Yeah, go ahead.
I'm just wondering, do you think there's a possibility that Facebook is not pursuing this behavior for profit, but because they actually really want to connect people and they think that the benefits of that are nobler and outweigh the costs of that?
Okay, the question is, do you think that Facebook is pursuing these things not for money, but because of the mission of connecting people, and that is a noble enough cause to work towards? Is that right?
Yeah, just like, do you think it's possible? And then also just like seeing that Zuckerberg really makes all the decisions and he's got the voting rights to do that. He's not really beholden to shareholders if he, you know, represents over 51% of the voting rights. So
Right, like he owns the company and he could take it if he felt like. Yeah, okay.
I think that there are people who work at Facebook who absolutely believe that connecting the world is a noble and good cause, and that is the reason they work there. And I agree with them. I think that there are parts of the world that have been made better, people's lives that have been made better by connecting the world. I also think that it serves Facebook's business interests to say that connecting the world is a good and noble cause, because connecting the world also means bringing more people online to your particular platform where they're likely to become lifelong users and send you a lot of their data and money. So 2 things in my mind can be true at the same time. And I sometimes try to imagine what it's like to be Mark Zuckerberg. You know, I try to imagine what it's like to be a billionaire and to know that you've become one of the world's most powerful and wealthy individuals by creating this social media empire. And I imagine like the story you have to tell yourself is that it's net good, that what you introduced to the world was a net good, and that's how you sleep at night. And I think that's persuasive to him, right? Like I imagine that has to be persuasive. Otherwise, you know, I think he'd be taking very different steps. I think it's very, very hard. And actually, there was an interview he did a couple years ago with Yuval Noah Harari that I love to watch, because Mark he's got a bit of an ego, and I think he thinks most people are his intellectual inferior, but he really admires Yuval Noah Harari. You could tell he really looks up to him, and he's read the books and he's a fan. And at one point in the interview, there's this moment where he kind of says to Yuval, like, well, but it's connecting the world, it's our noble, and it's a worthwhile cause, it's a noble cause. And Yuval kind of turns back and he's like, is it? And you can see Mark's face just kind of like crumble a little. And he really questions, like, you can tell it's a moment of like, what? How do you not agree with my most basic premise? Like, my moral compass points north on this. And if you don't agree with that, well, like, you can tell he's lost his footing for a second. And so, yeah, I watched that interview and I sometimes like die a little bit inside because I wish I was a journalist in that room being like, go, just talk a little, just go, like follow that path a little bit longer, because that could have been such a fascinating and intellectually stimulating discussion to have.
Okay, in the BE, please.
Yes, and I forgot I put this on. If anger is the emotion that evokes engagement on Facebook, doesn't that say just as much or maybe more about human nature than it does about the algorithm? Isn't Facebook kind of just like holding up a mirror to society in that way?
Okay, so the question is, if anger is a really successful emotion on Facebook, is that more a humanity problem than an algorithmic problem? And is Facebook just holding up a mirror to us as a society that we enjoy anger and drama?
That we engage with it.
That we engage with it.
Yeah, I think so. I mean, I do think that, and I've said that to Facebook executives when I interview them. I think that I'm very different than the average Facebook executive in that I spent the majority of my professional life not living in America. I lived in the Middle East for 10 years. And so I saw firsthand, right? Like, what do people immediately gravitate towards on social media when they join? What do they post? Where do, I saw it. And I remember having these discussions where they were like, no, people want to see happy posts and posts that inspire them and make them feel good. And I was like, really? Like, I don't know. I don't see that. Like, that's not my experience. I like to make the comparison here of candy or sugar though, which is that human nature isn't always to do what's best for us, right? Like, if you were told nothing about the nutritional content of food in front of you and you were given a bowl of like gummy bears and then a bunch of celery, you'd be like, great, gummy bears, I'm gonna eat nothing but gummy bears for the rest of my life. These are fantastic. Or chocolate or whatever, name the candy. But you have to be told that's not good for you. Like, that's bad, that's gonna rot your brain. And I sometimes think of the algorithms in the same way, right? Which, like, are they favoring what people are naturally drawn to? Yes. But what people are naturally drawn to may not be what's good for them or what's healthy for their mind or what they really even want to see, is I guess my point. Like, you might not want to see stuff that makes you angry all day because you know it's bad for you, but you can't help but click on it because you can't believe your crazy aunt posted that thing on Facebook. Not speaking from experience or anything.
Okay, yeah, you up here in the front, what's your question?
Brad Parscale was in charge of Trump's campaign, and he was bragging at one time about how Facebook just let all his people in there, they trained everyone on what to do and optimize whatever. Is that basically true? Will they train anyone, or do they care?
Okay, so Brad Parscale, who was Trump's campaign manager during 2016, was bragging at one point about how Facebook helped train the campaign on how to use the platform. And the question is that true? Do they just allow anyone to come in and exploit the platform?
So at the time, yes. At the time, Facebook had a political division that would train any candidate, including, by the way, like the Modi campaign in India, Duterte in the Philippines. It wasn't just here in America. They would come and train you. They would teach you how to do what they call A/B testing, which is a way of running multiple versions of different ads and seeing what people clicked on, and then choosing the one that was the most effective. And it's a really great tool that commercial users of Facebook have had for years, but this was the introduction of it into the political echelons. Politicians couldn't do that before. You had a message, you might run one or two versions of it, but you couldn't you couldn't say 16 versions of a thing and then within an hour choose the one that was affecting the most people and then blast that out and then constantly tweak. Like, it was a pretty amazing machinery behind the Trump campaign in the 2016 elections. But I will say this, like, they approached Hillary Clinton with the same offer. They went to Hillary Clinton and said, here's this amazing tool we built. You can A/B test your ads. We will put people in your office to teach you how to use it, just like they did with Pascal. And her office said no. She turned them down. She didn't, well, I don't know if she was involved in the decision, but her office made the decision to not have that assistance. So I think, the rest is history, but I think it's important to remember that Facebook did offer that to every candidate in 2016.
Okay, can we do a few more questions, or should we
Yes, we're
go
good.
sidebars?
Keep
We're
going.
good, okay, cool. Yeah, go ahead and head back.
I'm Crystal, by the way, that candy, because you click on it once, you get more and more candy and less and less scale. But I was just curious what you think of the suggestions Roger McNamee made in his piece op-ed in Time. He suggested ban surveillance capitalism, amend section 230 and antitrust. So make sure there's more competition.
Okay, so Roger McNamee made some suggestions in an op-ed about how to rein in Facebook. We're curious what Sheera thinks about them. There was ban surveillance capitalism, amend section 230 and antitrust.
So I think everyone kind of wants to amend section 230 or update section 230. I think there's a lot of energy by Democrats and Republicans. So that's almost like standing up and being like, protect our children. And everyone goes, yeah, because no one's gonna say no.
Everyone in Congress.
Everyone in Congress,
Maybe not
right?
everyone in the Valley, but.
Right. So I think amending section 230 is an easy win that people, well, easy as in, it'll be on Washington DC's timeline, so it could take 5-6 years, but there's energy behind it. And I think in terms of antitrust, it's important for the FTC and other organizations to begin looking at new mergers. And I do think that Facebook would not be able to acquire the kind of companies it has acquired in the past in today's environment. So a big part of this was that for years, Facebook was acquiring competition, right, left and right, and nobody was doing anything about it. We're in a very different environment. Facebook tried to acquire TikTok for $1 billion and they said, no, thank you, because they rightfully saw that they would surpass that very quickly. So we're in different times. There is gonna be more antitrust action, I think, across Silicon Valley. On the first point on banning surveillance capitalism, I'm never sure what people mean by that. Because that's like half the startups in Silicon Valley, right? That's a lot of companies. Sorry, Kate, by the way, knows a lot about this. She has written a ton about, these kinds of companies. And so you know what I'm talking about. This is a lot of the Valley, this sells. And it's what's being developed in countries all over the world, like Russia, China, they're all developing these kinds of companies right now, these kinds of technology. So I don't know, maybe I'm cynical, but I don't think we're moving away from that. I think data is a commodity and data on people is going to be incredibly powerful and precious going forward. And I look at countries honestly, I look at the Middle East, I look at Israel and Egypt and the UAE, where they've been collecting data on individuals for years. And people have kind of gone along with that, and that's become part of the culture in those countries. And I think that's kind of where we're heading. I don't know if I'm not saying it's the right way, but it does feel like that's where we're heading.
Okay, sure, in the second row here.
Why does so much of the reporting on criticism of Facebook focus on divisiveness versus it's often including the Haugen testimony, it's oh, they were allowing sex slavery to proliferate. They were allowing violent groups to form. They were hurting teenage girls and divisiveness. Why is that? That seems like such a personal call. This thing about anger and fighting and I guess I get why your uncle's angry post might eventually lead to violence, but why is that considered so important on the level of these very serious things?
Okay, so the question is, why is the divisive content so newsworthy? Why we pay so much attention to these things, and Congress is asking about it, in terms of the violent content, the effects on teenage girls, sex trafficking. Why are these issues sort of front and center?
I think divisiveness, and I am guilty about this as a reporter, so thank you for that question because it's making me think. It's a catch-all. When I write divisiveness, I'm thinking in my mind about what happened in Myanmar, and I'm thinking about Sri Lanka, and I'm thinking about just last year, Ethiopia. I am thinking about all these things that my editor will not let me spend 3 paragraphs going into in every single story. and how divisive content has led to real world violence in so many parts of the world. But hearing you talk about it now, like, yeah, the average reader doesn't know that's what I'm talking about. The average reader doesn't know in congressional testimony that often when we talk about divisiveness, we're talking about language and insightful posts that lead to real world violence, like what happened with militias here in the United States. So yeah, it's interesting. It's an interesting question. I think it has unfortunately become a bit of a catch-all term of any kind of content that leads to two groups being really mad at each other.
Yeah, and I think you know, you were talking earlier about the mission of Facebook and like, do people believe that this is a good thing? I think reporters are also kind of thinking about this sort of do-gooder mentality of like, how can we be effective? How can we be most helpful? And I think a lot of people focus on these issues because the idea is like, okay, we've seen this get really bad. Could we discuss it before it gets really bad? Could we talk about it before it gets there? You know, and if there is sex trafficking on Facebook, you know, it's probably not the majority of content that you and I are seeing in our feeds, but, you know, could we talk about it? Could we do something about it before it becomes a widespread issue? I think that's often like a media motive, I guess I would say. Okay. In the very, very back, yes.
I'm kind of about how you wrote the books. You said you interviewed hundreds of people.
Let's talk about how we wrote the book. I'm so
Yeah.
excited. Thank you.
All the rest of the questions are awesome. But so you mentioned that you interviewed hundreds of people, some of whom are no longer Facebook employees, but the majority still work there. Would you say the majority were disgruntled and willing to kind of expose all, or did you also get sort of pro-Facebook opinions as well?
Okay, so the question is, Sheera and her reporting partner Cecilia interviewed hundreds of people at Facebook for the book. Were most of them disgruntled employees, or were some of them giving like a pro-Facebook narrative or a positive story about what was going on at the company?
Yeah, so I want to give a shout out to my co-author Cecilia Kang, who lives in Washington and couldn't be here today. We interviewed, you know, what was interesting is how we kind of divided it up. She focused a lot more on the people that worked in the political and policy side of Facebook, and I focused more on engineering ranks and security team and people that were physically here. And what I liked about that is that it let us get multiple perspectives in the room, because it's never black and white. Like, you never meet somebody who's like, I work there, but I hate it, or I work there, but I love it. It's like, it's usually complicated. They usually have a really complicated relationship with the company. So they've been in a meeting where someone's making a decision about Nancy Pelosi's video and whether or not they should remove it. And just to remind everybody, this happens, you know, a video of Nancy Pelosi gets uploaded in which she's edited to appear as if she is drunk and inebriated. And it goes viral. And there's a debate within Facebook about whether to take it down. So I go talk to 2-3 employees and I'm like, what happened? What was the debate? And they're pissed off and they're yelling, oh, the executives said this and they said that, and they should have taken it down and they didn't, Cecilia will go to 2-3 other people who were in the room, who were in Washington, and they're doing the opposite, right? They're saying, oh God, those employees, they just want to take everything down. They don't have any sense of freedom of speech. And so one of the reasons we stress how many people we talk to is that most of the people we talk to find that working at Facebook is really complicated and hard. And that these arguments about what to remove, what to take down, how to make these decisions are often complicated. And so we got multiple perspectives on everything we covered. And
We talked to 400 people?
it was over 400 by our final count. It was a lot. And I'd say that, you know, yeah, there was a handful that were disgruntled in the sense where like, I'm getting ready to quit, I'll tell you anything you want to know. But that's not the majority, and that's actually not the important person. I mean, some of them, I don't mean to say one's more important than the other, but like the people I really like talking to are the ones like, I love Facebook, like I love being here. I really think my job is important. I think it's crucial. I am the person on the platform that can stop this random group or can do this particular kind of work. And I found those conversations so fascinating and so important because they wanted to give me an inside picture of how hard it is and how much they've struggled to kind of do what they think is the right thing. And so, yeah, I guess I just want to say that's one of the reasons why it was really hard for me when the company came out and dismissed our book and our reporting by saying, oh, well, you know, they only talk to people that hate Facebook. The only people that talk to them are disgruntled ex-employees. And I got mad because I was like, no, man, like these are people that work for you that really want to make it better, that often put in all the extra hours and stay late on the projects and work through their weekends. Like these are really good employees. I'm shocked at how devoted they are to your company and making it better. And they talk to me because they're struggling. They're like Frances Haugen, like they're at the end of their tether. So yeah, I personally found that odd when the company wanted to dismiss what so many of its own employees were saying.
Yeah, and I think a common narrative to discredit reporting is that, oh, this is a disgruntled employee, they're really unhappy. And, you know, most people don't leave their jobs like that, you know, like you get a better offer, you move on to something else, like maybe you had some complaints or a boss you didn't like or a coworker who was kind of weird, but like, you know, most people don't leave their job or move on from a company and kind of burn it down. So that's a really common narrative that you'll see companies roll out to say like, oh, this person's just disgruntled. It's like, that's pretty rare, actually. You know, and I think Sheera kind of touched on this, but you know, sometimes people who are really angry at their company don't make the best sources, and you can kind of tell like they're just really upset. They really want to push it to, you know, I'm upset with this person and I want to hurt them, or I want to say something that's going to damage, you know, the credibility of my boss for whatever reason. And you know, it's often information that you can't really confirm with other people because the experience is rare to be that pissed, and other people don't share it. Okay, that was just my 2 cents. Yeah. Should we do one more? Okay, let's do, yes, one more in the back. Go ahead.
Given that they weren't all that disgruntled, like how do you get people to break their NDAs, one, to talk to you, and two, like how much do you think the Silence No More Act is going to change the nature of both of your reporting?
Okay, that's a great question. The first part of it is how do you get people to talk to you when they're under an NDA, a non-disclosure agreement that prevents them from speaking publicly about the work that they do, and how will the Silence No More Act change reporting? For those of you guys who don't know, Silence No More Act is legislation that just passed in California that a former Pinterest employee kind of spearheaded to allow whistleblowers to break their NDAs with companies in cases of sexual harassment and assault.
Yeah, I had a journalism professor that early on told me that as a reporter, you always want to be the kind of reporter that dates to marry. And I love that advice because, you know, you can get like good, fast, easy stories out of people usually. People often want to show off about what they know when you tell them you're a reporter, but it's never satisfying, right? Like it's like I was gonna use expletives, but I won't. But like it's never satisfying, right? Because after dark, I swear. They walk away feeling cheap and used. They haven't told you the nuance and the context behind what they know. You walk away feeling like you have half a story. It's just not the kind of reporting I ever wanted to do. And so most of my sources I've known for years. Like the first 3 times, 2-3 times we meet, where I offer like on the bat, I'm like, let's just talk on background or off record, right? And so off record means I can't use anything they say. On background means I can use it, but just to inform my thinking, I can't quote them. And I do that because I want them to get comfortable. I want them to get to know me. I want to get to know them. I want them to know that I'm not the kind of reporter that's going to take something they say and immediately print it. And so, yeah, I mean, actually, I had one amazing source for this book who told me the reason he wanted to talk to me as much as he did was because the first time he met me, he told me something really salacious. And I said, great, I have to check it. I'm not gonna print that because you said it. I'm now gonna go find 3 independent sources who say they heard the same thing you heard. And he just thought like, oh wow, like you're actually not gonna take me on my word. You're gonna check everything I say. You're gonna fact check it for me, essentially. And I think people like that. Like they want to know that you're doing your due diligence. They want to know that you're developing them and you want to understand everything they have to tell you about a subject. I think that's super important as a reporter to let them get to know you too and what the reporting process is like. Because I mean, maybe I'm biased, and Kate, I don't know if you find this, but I find that people who are friends with reporters and know us trust journalism more and trust reporters more because they know how hard it is to actually get a story in the paper, how much sourcing it takes and checking and double checking and fact checking and lawyers looking at it. Like, it is hard. And so when you trust that process and you know it close hand, you're probably more likely to want to invest in it and tell your story and share what you know with a reporter. Oh, and do you want to do silence no more?
Yeah, I can talk about that. And I think I experience both sides of this, right? Especially, working at the New York Times, we're sometimes in the news ourselves. And so I get approached by media reporters every once in a while. And like, oh, do you want to tell me about this? Do you want to tell me about that? And I was like, of course not. I'm trying to keep my job. What are you thinking? But I think, again, like, there's a sense that some of these things are, some of the things that are going on at Facebook and some of these other companies are so important and have such an impact on our lives that it is worth the risk to tell that story because it is important to the public. I think often, like, the things that I get asked about, I don't think are that important to the public. They're like, who do you think the next editor is going to be? Who's going to succeed Dean Baquet? And I'm like, I don't know. And also, like, I don't know if the public cares that much. I don't think it's going to change the world if anyone like gets the hot scoop on who our editor is going to be. But I think I feel differently about stories that do feel like they have an impact on the world, right? And I think that that's what's motivating for a lot of whistleblowers in situations like this. I've gotten flack from employees before of like, why would you report this internal meeting? That was between us. That was supposed to be secret. And it's like, well, like, you're making a decision about censorship in China, and maybe people in China deserve to know how that decision got made. But maybe it's not just between you and your boss. There is like this really overwhelming public interest in what's going on. And so I think that's a motivation for a lot of people to kind of take that legal risk, right, to speak out against their NDA. And then you mentioned the Silence No More Act. I think that is really, really important. It's also really, really narrow, right? It's allowing employees to speak out about harassment and abuse. It's not just allowing people to break their NDA for any old reason. And I think that is really important. It's really long overdue. I'm seeing in the Harvey Weinstein stories and a lot of other reporting in the last couple of years, how people have been abused in the workplace and then forced to keep silent because of these legal agreements. So, I think it's a great step, and I think it will allow people to come forward about that narrow set of issues, that there is no reason to keep secret. It's not a trade secret. It's not proprietary information of how someone was abused, and they have the right to tell that story. And I think the law affirms that. Okay, I think we're done. I think Sheera's gonna sign some books. Sheera, thank you so much for doing this. Can you guys thank you so much for a great question.
Good evening, everyone. Could we give another hand to Kate and Sheryl? Programming here at Facebook. No, Manny's so sorry. I think I just canceled myself. And basically, it's gonna take a moment to recover. Just wanted to tell you a little bit about Manny's, what we have coming up, and how you can get a book and get it signed. So we would not be here if it were not for the gentleman sitting, who's now in the corner, Manny, who had he was down there, who had a vision of creating a space where the community could come and engage in political and civic life. And what we have here tonight, you are all a demonstration of that vision coming true. We're here having this conversation, this Q&A, really went in directions I think a lot of us might have been surprised by, but it was lively and it was great. And if we could just give Manny a round of applause. You all had this opportunity to have this really rich conversation. That was amazing. Thank you so much. And we have a lot of great programming coming up that I want to make you all aware of. But before I do that, I want to tell you about something that's very important to making an event like this possible. And it is our sponsorship program. We are more focused on getting butts in seats to get information, to learn, and to take it out to the community, as opposed to necessarily tickets and charging crazy amounts. But the reason we're able to do that is we have a dedicated core of supporters who contribute $36 a month, and they got us through the pandemic. They have made it possible. So if something about tonight really spoke to you and all the great events that we have coming up that I'll tell you about speak to you, please consider becoming a sponsor. You can scan the QR code or reach out to myself or Manny, and we're happy to tell you all about that. Now, with regard to what else we have going on this week, we are, yes, the place for political and civic life, but we are also a place to have a lot of fun, and I'm so excited. Tomorrow, we're gonna have an event for people who are interested in career change. We have friends of Manny's who've actually made that transition. We're gonna share their stories, and then we're also going to turn it almost into a working event. So if this is you, or if not you, someone you know who's looking for something different, tell them to come on by tomorrow. On Thursday, this is what I'm really excited about. Juanita Moore, who is a living local icon of the drag scene, of the activist community here in San Francisco, is going to be on our stage. She doesn't really give a lot of interviews, but because she's busy, she's making a difference. She's got wigs, she's got so much, like her shows are amazing. So this is a rare opportunity to hear from a true treasure of our city. And again, that's gonna be on Thursday. You can find out more information for that at welcometomannys.com. Next week, we are going to open our stage to women, trans Latinx women, so they can share their stories. We don't often hear much about their narrative, and we are so grateful to be able to give them the stage next Tuesday. And then full circle on reporters and journalism. On Wednesday, we're going to have the new editors for the San Francisco Chronicle and the Examiner talking about the future of journalism here in San Francisco. So needless to say, we are hustling and keeping it busy and providing as much programming and things that the community has told us they want to hear. So please do consider supporting us with our events, consider becoming a sponsor, and make sure you go buy some books. We have the books set up over there. Ram, do you mind raising? Ram is displaying the book. You can purchase the book there, and Sheryl will be so kind as to sign. But I know I'm a bit long-winded, so sorry, I'm the daughter of a preacher from the South. I apologize. So just want to say again, thank you all so much for coming out tonight. Thank you to our guests. I hope you all had an amazing evening and that we will sell out of those books. Take care, and we will see you hopefully tomorrow. Thank you.